Hi guys, welcome to Delores Studios. The tutorial I'm about presenting had been widely demanded for, and I actually took my time to come out with something decent. We'll be diving into specifics of how to create a shopping cart system for Android application, which is basically the fragrance eShop. This will be a good startup for any e-commerce platform on Android. PayPal payment system will be integrated and code simplicity would also be achieved. In this app, data will be passed into app system from an embedded raw JSON file, which is basically of key value pairs, which could be replaced with an API on online data. We'll be focusing more on how to consume those data and implement some logic to make this whole structure work. Let's head straight to Android Studio and get started. Right here in Android Studio, I'm actually going to break this video into modules because it's quite rich and embedded. Firstly, we'll be talking about the layout structure and the data structure as well, where we'll get to talk about the DB helper, the content provider, and sort. Later on, we'll be looking at the display, that's the activity involved in displaying all this together. So we'll be headed straight to the build Gradle, where we talk about the dependencies that were included in this application. We have the recycler view, the card view, and BombTech, which is the glide, which will actually help us to display images and catch those images on the fly. We'll be using the fourth ensemble, which will help us with the badge drawable. As well, we'll be integrating the PayPal Android SDK, which will help us at checkout. Let's head straight to the layout and let's understand how the structure of this application is. In the activity main XML, which is basically a layout that displays the cards of each fragrance, that's of each item. So this is actually going to undo this. But before I continue with our layout structure, let's get to look at the data that we'll be expecting, which is right embedded in the raw folder called the fragrance JSON. This is basically the key value pairs, where we have the fragrance as the first key, which houses a bunch of array, and they are all wrapped in an object. The first object depicts the first item, which we have as the fragrance name as the key and the value beside it. Also, we have the description of the particular fragrance. This, for example, is called the Versace Eros. We have the image URL, which we're actually going to be calling from the cloud, which has a static path with also the inclusion, which is the MIME type. We have the price, which is in USD, and the user rating, which will be depicted by the star rating. So all this structure will be called right there as the data which we'll be using to display in our layouts. Back to the activity main, we have a recycler view right there to actually use, whereby we point to an ID of recycler view. We can actually disable inspection. This is not going to disturb anything, but cool, we have it set up. So after this, we'll all need a card, which is called the fragrance card. This is actually going to display each grid picture of the item, and we actually wrap this around the card view. And in the card view, you have an image view, which is basically going to display the picture of the fragrance in question. And you also have the title of each fragrance. Cool. Let's get to look at the fragrance details. So on click of a fragrance grid, we take you down to a detail page, and in this detail page you can get to customize more on each fragrance. Probably you want to add more quantity or you want more than one quantity to be ordered, at the same time, the user is going to have the ability to actually add this particular item to cart. So that's the beauty of this detail page. So it's actually wrapped around a scroll view because we still have some other attributes underneath, and an image view which actually going to create a larger image of that particular item. The description of the item. This is a rating bar to actually tell users how this particular item is doing on the stores. Probably it has a very bad rating, or users are really enjoying it. We have a table layout that actually structure the price of this particular item, which houses in a row. Cool. Let's get to look at other aspects where we get to have the quantity. Specific quantity that we are looking at, we have an increment and decrement button. An increment increases the quantity you want, while the decrement reduces the quantity. So that is very needed. And lastly, you get to have the total of what you are actually purchasing. So that is actually going to make some calculation based on the quantity you selected. Lastly, we have a button to add to cart. This button will actually trigger a method called add to cart, which will add this to the cart database. Cool. Now we understand how the details work. So let's get to look at the Cards XML. The Cards XML actually houses another set of tables where users can easily delete a particular item from the cart or move ahead to checkout. So that's how the structure actually looks. And at the same time, users will be able to see the total price of all the items they've added to cart. So I think that makes sense. So we have the button which triggers the checkout, and this is actually going to call the PayPal for further implementation. We have the cart item that's actually going to depict each item that you added to cart, an image, the fragrance name, the quantity, and the price. With this analysis, I believe we understand how the layout is actually going to look like. So we'll be headed straight through the logic of this application, where we talk about the Java class. We'll get to talk about the cart badge later on, but let's talk about the data. In the data structure, we have the fragrance contract, which actually we all know what the contract is, which is binding what you actually declared, the content authority, the columns, the table name, and so on. The DB helper, which communicates with the open helper and actually creates your database, creates your table, and we have the provider. Let's get to look at that. In the fragrance class, this is actually a fragrance class that takes some fields. In the fragrance, we're going to be expecting the ID of the particular fragrance name, the description of the fragrance, the image URL, the price of that particular fragrance, and the rating of the fragrance. We have a constructor that takes a cursor, and what do we understand by a cursor? That's the database details. So definitely this is actually communicating with the database. So in this, we initialize the name, description, image URL, price, and user rating based on the value we got from the database column, where we call the cursor to get the string of the fragrance entry, the column name, the column description, the column image, the column price, and the user rating. Let's get to look at how we actually declared all those columns in the fragrance contract. In the fragrance contract, you have a constructor, an empty constructor, which can be usable later on, and the content authority, which is the name for the entire content provider, similar to the relationship between a domain name and its website, which we gave the package com.studios.fragrance cart. This is going to be unique to this particular application. It's always good to use a content authority that doesn't conflict with other content authority in the stores. Now we have a base content URL. This is actually going to create the content to the content provider. Where we pass the content, there's a path to the content authority. And we have two paths here. The first path is to the fragrance, and the second is to the cart. We're actually going to undo these two concurrently. So I really want you to be focused here. We declared an inner class that defines the constant values of the fragrance database table. Each entry in the table represents a single fragrance. This implements the base columns, and you declare the content URI to access the fragrance data in the provider, where you appended to path the base content URL and the path fragrance we declared up there. You also need to declare the content URI path to the cart. Now we are having two different paths, the path to the fragrance and to the cart. So don't forget, the same thing you did to the path to the fragrance, you declare the base content URI with a path cart. Now we have the MIME type of the content URI of a list of fragrance and carts, where we have the content list type of the path to the fragrance and the content item type also to the path to the fragrance. We might not be needing those implementation. This comes to where we declare the table name of the fragrance called fragrances and the table name of the cart called the cart table and called cart. So if you notice, we are creating two tables which will be sitting right inside a database. We create a unique ID for the fragrance called the underscore ID, and also another unique ID for the cart ID. So we'll be doing the two together. You don't have to leave one and move with the other. The two are very important. So now let's declare different columns for the fragrance and for the cart. For the fragrance, we have the column name, the description, image, price, and the user rating. While for the cart, we have the cart name, the cart image, the cart quantity, and the cart total price. So those are the attributes we are expecting. Now we've declared the columns. So cool. We have our contract set and fully functional. Heading straight to the DB helper. This is where the data logic actually lies. The fragrance DB helper extends the SQLite open helper. And we have the tag, which will help us to spit out to the console. Now we have the database name called the fragrances.db and the database version. Declare a context with the SQLite database objects and also the content resolver objects. Cool. Now we're going to call the resources, which is actually going to help us to read data from the res and assets folder where we have our raw JSON. A constructor to the fragrance DB helper, and we initialize those objects created, the resources, the content resolver, and the DB, which gets the writable database. When you extend the SQLite open helper, you have to override two methods, the onCreate and the onUpgrade. Right there in the onCreate method, this is where you get to create the table. Now we're going to be creating the two tables involved. The first table is the fragrance table, where we have its column highlighted, the name, description, image, price, and user rating. We have the ID as an integer data type, which is an auto increment, while we have the price as a real data type. Cool. We have the user rating as an integer data type. Let's get to look at the cart, the fragrance cart table. This time we have the cart ID as an integer, the name, image, quantity, and price. Now the price is a real data type. You call the DB to execute the SQL create fragrance table and the DB to also execute the SQL creates cat fragrance table. So that's going to actually create the two tables right inside the database. We use a try and catch block to read the fragrance from resources where we pass the DB as a parameter. You catch for two exceptions: the input and output exception, that's the IO exception, and the JSON exception, and you print that out to tag strings. Cool. On upgrade, you drop the table and recreate them. We have two tables in question. Now let's look at the read fragrances from resources. This is where we actually talk about how to read the data from the JSON we're having. We pass in the DB as in the parameter, and we're going to throw through a true exception, which is the IO exception and the JSON exception. That's why when you are implementing it over here in the onCreate method, you need to catch for those two exceptions. Cool. We have the stream builder instantiated. The same thing goes for the input stream. Now, the resources object we created, we open up the raw resource, which is the raw folder called the fragrance JSON. The buffered reader is right there to take up the input stream object, which you have instantiated and passing the in as a parameter. We have a string for the line. Now a while loop runs while the line is equals to the reader read line, which is the buffered reader here. It mustn't be null. That's for this test. The builder will append each line. So now the builder will have some values, which is the stream builder. In here, you need to pass the resource into the key values, which is the raw JSON, where you convert the builder to string. Cool. Now you have it as a raw JSON, as a string value. Here we need to declare the fields we are looking at, which is the fragrance name, the description, image URL, price, and user rating. So we pass those values to strings final variables. Cool. We have a try and catch block right there where we talk about JSON objects and the JSON array. We have a JSON object of fragrance JSON instantiated, and you pass in the raw JSON as a parameter. Now if you notice, the first level is a fragrance array where you have right there. I'll quickly show you how the fragrance JSON release. This is the array we are looking at. We first of all have an object right there, which we have here. And now when you get into the fragrances, you have an array. So back to the fragrance DB helper. So that takes us down to the array you see here. And in this array, you call the fragrance JSON, which is an object, to get the JSON array of the fragrances, which is the fragrances you have here. Cool. Also, the fragrances you have here. Back to the DB helper. Now you need to create a for loop to iterate through the array, because this is an array and you need to iterate through. Let's get to look at the structure of the for loop. This is the counter variable if the I is equals to 0 and the I is less than the fragrance array. When you get the length, how long, how many objects do we have in the array, and an iteration so that this is actually going to get to false. Once it gets to false, the loop ended. In the process, we're expecting some values, the fragrance name, descriptions, image URL. Now you're going to use their corresponding data type, where you see the double for price, integer for rating. We have the details, where you get the fragrance array to get the JSON object of the particular index. You pass that to the fragrance details. So in these details, that's when you get their corresponding values. You get the string of the BGS fragrance name, well, we've declared right there as the fragrance name, which is also what you see here, the fragrance name, the description, image URL, price, and so on. So that's how we are actually pointing to that. So you pass that to the variable, fragrance name, you pass that to the description, pass that to the URL, pass that to the price, and also to the user rating. So they have a value now. You call the content values, since we want to add this to the database, where you're going to put each values to their corresponding columns. You have that setup. You have the setup and setup. After that, you trigger the insert to the database. This is actually going to insert all the fragrances values into the table name, which is the fragrance table, not the cards table. We are not talking about that now. So the only exception you might see here is JSON exception, which you actually print that out to stack trace. Cool. I think we understand how this flows. We get the raw values and we save them straight down to the database. So from the database, we get to call them to the layout, to the activities, use them, manipulate with them. Cool. Let's get to look at the fragrance provider, which will be the last in this part. Get to talk about that aspect later on, so that this video won't be unduly lengthy. We have the URI matcher of the fragrances. We have for the fragrance ID, that's for single fragrance. This is for all fragrances. We have for the cards, a single all cards, while this is for a single card. We extend the content provider. When you extend the content provider, you should know we're going to override some methods. The query method, the insert method, the delete method, and the update method. Now we have a URI matcher. You have to match which URI are you getting. Is it a path to the fragrance or the path to the card? So that's why we have to look closely here. So we have the path to the fragrances here, and we have the path to the cards table. And also, we have for single one, which is for the fragrance, one of the fragrance, and over here, one item in the cart. Instantiate the fragrance developer. In the onCreate, you need to instantiate that to make that work. And in our query method, we have the SQLite database, which gets the readable database so that we'll be able to use this fragrance developer, and the cursor, which all the results of all the query. Now let's figure out if the URI matcher can match the URI to a specific code. So now we have the switch match, which is from the URI matcher. So if the first case is the fragrances, that's all fragrances, all items in the fragrance table. That's what that is. So that the query will actually run, where you query for the table name, the projection, the selection, and the selection argument, and you return the cursor. Now, if it's for all items in the cart, the same thing will go on, but now this time you won't use the table name, you use the cart table, because we have a different table for that. You return the value for the cursor. Now, if for the one item in the cart, which is the cart with an ID, this is when you have to do a selection with an ID, which actually needs a value. That's a question mark. This is needed. And the argument will be based on this structure. Now you run the cost, you run the query again. So now definitely you're expecting a cart ID. So for a specific item will be returned, not all items in the cart. The same thing goes for the fragrance with an ID. So you have that done as well. So I think we've been able to do justice to the query method. Now you need to set the notification URI on the cursor, so we know that the content URI, which the cursor was created for, if the data at this URI changes, then we know that we need to update the cursor. So that's the essence of setting the notification URI that get the context and get the content resolver, which you have the URI as the parameter. So this returns a cursor. Cool. We have the get type. We only need fragrances, where you return the insert cart, which you have the URI and the content values that you are actually inserting to the fragrances. Let's get to look at the insert cart that we are actually looking at. Now, the get type is not implemented, sorry, but we're talking about the insert this time, when you are inserting to the fragrances table. Now, we have the insert cards. We get the writable database. If you notice, we actually inserted directly to the fragrances DB using the db.insert. But this is for the cards. When we are inserting to the cards, we are going to use a content provider. So you can just interchange. Sometimes you use a direct entry, sometimes you use a content provider. But cool, recommended, always use a content provider. You insert the new card with the given values, which you have here, and you notify all listeners that the data has been changed for the card's content URI. The same thing goes for the delete. When we delete, we all need the DB, which is the get writable database. And you need to return a value, which is the deleted value. So we have to keep track of the number of deleted tags. We match up the URI. Definitely, if you are deleting, you delete a specific item. You can delete all items, but now we need a specific, because you can just take away a slide will delete one particular item from the cart. So we need the ID, where you call the URI get path segment, and you get the first. And now you pass into the cart deleted the DB to delete the from the table and the ID in question. So you got that deleted. So you need to also notify the resolver of a change and return the number of items deleted using this if statement. If the cart deleted is not equals to 0, the tax was deleted. So you set the notification and you return the number of tax deleted. That's the number of cart item deleted. I think we've been able to do justice to our data structure, the fragrance contract, the DB helper, and the provider. This is a solid block for any Android application. Now let's get to look at the manifest, where we'll integrate the content provider. Over here, you have to lock in your content provider before that could be triggered. So in our second part of this video, we'll be talking about the badge countable, where we get to create our shopping cart icon to actually keep track of how many items we have in the cart. So once you add one item to the cart, there will be a counter which will be notified at the top that you have one item added. So once you delete as well, it decrements. Once you add, it increments. Cool, I think that logic is fine. We'll get to talk about the layout itself, how to call from the content provider, how to call from the DB using the custom loader, which will run on the background, how to add each fragrance item to carts, and how to implement the checkout as well. So catch me up in the next part of this video, so we can actually do final justice to this cart system. Thank you very much for hanging out with me throughout this tutorial, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Don't go anywhere. The second part is right there on course on the way. Bye bye for now.